Good morning. Buenos días. Oh, that's great, but let me try it again. Buenos días. I love that energy. Bienvenue. One more time. Bienvenue. Perfect. Herzlich willkommen. I'll save you that one. So, I'm Ariadna de Villa, Assistant Professor of Spanish at Texas Lutheran University, and it is an honor to have you here this morning. Also, I would like to welcome those who are virtually present, and to have the opportunity to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Naja Ferjan Ramirez. Dr. Ramirez is an assistant professor in linguistics at the University of Washington and holds a distinguished professorship in language acquisition and multilingualism endowment. She earned her bachelor's degree in neuroscience from Brown University and her PhD in linguistics and cognitive science from the University of California, San Diego. She completed her postdoctoral training at the Institute of Learning and Brain Sciences at the University of Washington. Naja's research focuses on understanding the extent and origins of variability in brain growth and linguistic development among young children of diverse backgrounds. She uses multiple methodologies, including naturalistic recordings in children's homes and early education centers, magnetoencephalography, or MEG, and behavioral language measures in the lab. Naja is a proud mother of 3 young children who listen and speak 3 languages at home: Slovene, Spanish, and English. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ramirez.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor and such a pleasure to be here. And thank you, Ari, for this introduction. So I am here to tell you about brain and behavioral research in very, very young children, infants, and children between the ages of 0 and about 5 years of age. So we're going to be talking about kids before they go to school. And I have a particular interest in bilingual or multilingual kids, and I study their brain and language development. You might wonder why that is. Well, this early period between 0 and 5 is the period of the most intense brain growth. Their brains will never be the same again. And you might wonder, well, why bilingual or multilingual children? Really, studying these types of language environments provides an opportunity to study the interplay of biology and experience in shaping these infants' brains. So these are some of the reasons, but I will start out by asking you a question. All of us who work with students love multiple choice, so that's what we're going to start with. Here we go. This is an image that you have here, and it's me in my pajama, and my daughter here, who was at the time 10 days old. So the question is, when do babies start to learn language? Is it A, B, or C? C? All right, you guys are right. So C, at or before birth. And you might wonder, these babies, they're very little, right? If you've ever seen or held a newborn, you know that they can't do a whole lot, or they can't do a lot of things, right? They can't turn their head yet, so how in the world do we know what they know about language? Well, one thing we can do is you can measure their sucking rate, right? So babies, little babies, newborns, they can't do a whole lot of things, but they're very, very good at sucking. And it turns out that we can reliably measure that. So you can use a pacifier like this one, and then you hook it with a cord to a computer, and you can measure the rate of sucking. It's actually a fairly complicated procedure, and I'm not going to go into details of how this works, but the basic premise is that babies will suck more when they get excited. And so what we have learned through these studies is that they are actually exposed to language when they're still in their mom's bellies, right? The last trimester of pregnancy, they actually hear the language that is present in the environment. And when they're born, they can already differentiate between their native language, the language that was spoken around the mom, and a language that was not spoken around the mom. So they already come to the world a little biased. But really, what we want to look at today is how do babies go from this image on the left-hand side to this, which is now a kindergartner, right? Here, when they're infants, when they're newborns, they communicate predominantly by crying, right? And then by the time they go to kindergarten, they can argue with us convincingly about all kinds of things, right? For example, what I should bring her as a gift from my 24-hour trip to Texas, right? And in some cases, they can argue convincingly in multiple languages. So really, the question is, how does this happen? How do they go from here to here? What kind of a transformation takes place in the infant brain that allows for this rapid evolution, development of language to happen in such a short period of time? So one interesting thing to note is that the period between birth and around the time that kids go to school is the period of the most intense brain growth. If we just look at the volume of an infant brain, at birth, it's at about 25% of that of an adult size. And then by the time they're 5, it's at about 92% of the adult brain volume. Now let's think about this for a little bit. 25% at birth. If you've ever seen a newborn, you probably know that their head is big. They have big heads, right? And that's because their brains are about 25% of the volume of an adult. If you think about their bodies, they are definitely not at 25% of an adult body, right? That would be a big problem. They're not. So they have big brains already at birth, but just look at how much growth happens in the first 5 years of life. It goes from 25 to 92% of that of an adult brain volume. You might think that new brain cells or neurons are being born at an astonishing rate, but that is really not what's happening. We know that babies are actually born with almost all the neurons that they're ever going to have. So there isn't birth of neurons does not happen very much at all after birth. What is happening is that new brain connections are being formed at an astonishing rate, at a rate that will never be the same after the first 5 years of life. Okay, so new neurons are really not being born. It's the connections that are being formed at an astonishing rate during this time period. Brain connections or synapses are made, shaped, and reshaped by experiences, right? So that's a very important thing to keep in mind, is that it is experiences that guide which neural connections will form, which ones will become more efficient, and which ones will be eliminated, right? I like to think of our brains as being very similar to our thumbs. So if you all can show me your thumbs like this, okay, I'm seeing a lot of thumbs. And if I look like this from afar, your thumbs all kind of look alike, they all look very similar. And our brains from afar also all look very similar. And yet, if I look at the microscopic level, I would see that every single one of your fingerprints is actually different, right? I can fingerprint you and I'll know exactly who you are. And the same is true for your brains. If we look in detail, every brain is different, and that's what makes our culture so beautiful, right? Is that brains are different, and they're shaped and reshaped by our experiences. Just like your fingerprints, I can fingerprint you and I know who you are, your brains are different too. And they're different depending on your experience. One type of experience that I want to talk about today is language. It turns out that the types of linguistic experiences that babies have, they can vary a lot. They vary pretty vastly. And just to be clear, why do we care so much about language? Why is language so important? Well, if you think about a kindergartner like this, language is causally implicated in pretty much everything that a 5 or a 6-year-old does. Friendships, family, socio-emotional development, pre-literacy skills, pre-quantitative skills, problem solving, all of this depends on language, okay? So now let's take an in-depth look at the process of language acquisition. How does it all unfold? And I want to start out with one particularly important process within language development, and that is the process of phonetic learning. This is the stage when infants discover the sounds that are used to make words in their native language. So it's one of the earlier stages in language development, but it's a critical one because it predicts later stages in language development, such as vocabulary acquisition and grammatical growth. So one central phenomenon in phonetic learning is the transition from being what we call a universal listener to becoming a native language specialist or a culture-bound listener. So what does this mean? If you look at this chart, you will see that native sound discrimination, the ability to tell apart the different sounds in one's own native language, that ability becomes better and better between 6 and 12 months of age, and the opposite is true for one's ability to discriminate among non-native sounds. Okay, so what does this mean? It means that if I look at a monolingually raised baby, a baby, let's say, growing up in Seattle, okay, who is only exposed to English at home, that baby, at the age of 6 months, will be able to discriminate among the sounds of all the languages of the world, meaning Hindi sounds, German sounds, French sounds, Japanese. They can tell the difference among contrasts within these languages that they're not exposed to, up until about 6 to 8 months of age, okay? And then, slowly over time, they start to lose this ability. At the same time, though, they become selectively sensitive, better and better at discriminating the sounds of the language to which they're exposed, in this case, English. This is what we have known for a long time about monolingual development. It's a good thing. It allows babies to become really, really good at discriminating the contrasts that are important in their native language, and slowly over time, they focus on what matters, the language in the input, okay? And begin to lose the ability to discriminate among sounds that they're not exposed to. Now, of course, given that we are in a symposium on bilingualism and multilingualism, it brings up an important question. What happens to a baby who is exposed to 2 languages? Now, one way that we can study this question is by using magnetoencephalography, or MEG. Now this machine here looks very intimidating. We jokingly call it the hairdryer from Mars, but rest assured, it is actually completely safe and non-invasive and silent. For those of you who may have been in an MRI machine, MRI is loud, right? They tell you you gotta be completely safe like a statue and you can't move and it's loud and it's scary. This is not the case for MEG. MEG basically looks like, going on a car ride. And the only trick is that the baby's head has to be in this helmet here. But we have child-friendly ways of making sure that they stay in the helmet. At the Institute for Learning and Brain Sciences at the University of Washington, we are one of the first labs in the world with the MEG machine specifically configured for babies. And in one of our recent studies, we compared the brain responses to language sounds in bilingual babies, so babies from families where Spanish and English were spoken in the home, to about the same equal proportion, so about 50% Spanish, about 50% English. We compared these babies at 11 months of age to monolingual babies, babies who were exposed to only English in their homes and were age matched. So both groups of babies came to the lab at 11 months of age, just before they start producing their first words. And if you guys remember, around 11 months of age, that is the period when we know that monolingual babies have already transitioned and become native language specialists. They should be sensitive to native language sounds and not sensitive to the sounds that they're not hearing in the environment. So the question here is, how does the experience of growing up with two languages alter this transition from universal to native language specific listening? Can the infant brain specialize to encode two sets of sounds by 11 months of age? And are there any neural adaptations? Are there any other differences that we see in these babies' brain responses at 11 months of age? So I'm going to show you a quick video of what it looks like when an 11-monther comes into our lab to do an MEG study. So here's a baby girl who came with her dad. Again, 11 months old, half bilingual, half monolingual. And then to prepare these babies for MEG, we use a hat and then a special digitizing pen with which we track the shape of the baby's head. This procedure allows us to continuously monitor the baby's head position during the study. So if she moves while her head is in this helmet, we can know at all times where her head is, so we can still determine where the brain activity is coming from. Then we bring them into the MEG room, and they sit on a special high chair underneath the MEG helmet. Their parents can sit right next to them. Okay? And then during the actual study, this is what it looks like. Da, 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 da. Okay, so what you have heard is the stimuli that were used in the study. My sound quality here in this video is not very good, but really what these are they are sounds that differ from one another. Some sounds are common to both Spanish and English. Some sounds are specific to Spanish, meaning that they only exist in Spanish and not in English, and some sounds are specific to English, meaning that they exist in English but not in Spanish. So again, one sound exists in both languages, and then we have two specific sounds, one specific to Spanish, one specific to English. So really what we're going for is two types of contrast. For monolingual babies, one contrast is native and the other one is non-native, and for bilingual babies, both contrasts are native, okay? So what did we find? We found that brains of monolingual babies, by the time they are 11 months of age, They are specialized to process the sounds of English and not specialized to process the sounds of Spanish. I already told you this. There is nothing shocking, right? We knew this from previous behavioral work. By 11 months of age, babies have become native language specialists. They're really good at processing the sounds that are present in the environment, and they have lost the ability to discriminate the sounds that are not present in the environment. Now, what's interesting here is that if we have babies age-matched who are exposed to two languages, the brain can specialize to process two. What we see here is that the brains of bilingual babies are specialized to process the sounds of both languages, Spanish and English. Another finding is that the bilingual brain responses to English were just as strong as those seen in monolingual babies. So they are learning at the same rate, and they were capable to specialize in discriminating among the sounds in both languages. So we see that at 11 months, the baby brain is specialized in whatever language or languages are present in the environment. There was one other finding in the study that was somewhat unexpected. There's part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. It's right here at the very front of your brain. And we use this part of our brain for what we call executive functioning. So that means directing our attention, thinking flexibly, shifting back and forth between doing different tasks. Interestingly, what we found was that the bilingual group showed stronger brain activity, specifically in these prefrontal brain regions. Now, why would that be? One explanation is that the constant switching back and forth between two different languages that these babies engage in day in and day out, that it provides exercise for the brain, strengthening these brain networks that are used for flexible thinking and attention switching, and providing a cognitive boost to the bilinguals. Now, other studies in other labs that work with older populations have shown advantages. Much of the bilingual literature actually shows advantages in adults and older children when it comes to executive functioning. And this suggests that bilinguals might have enhanced executive function skills. What's interesting about our study is that we see brain differences in these specific brain networks at 11 months of age, so before these babies have ever uttered their first words. Okay, so I want to switch gears now and talk more specifically about some potential benefits and myths about bilingualism and multilingualism. I'm sure you all are aware of some of the benefits, but let's just state them anyway. Some are pretty obvious, like communication. We can talk to more people, right? We can talk to people outside of our own culture, which is a good thing. There are cognitive advantages. Some of them I have described already. Now, one other really interesting line of research that's not my own, but it has been done in multiple labs, is that bilingualism is known to serve as a protective factor against Alzheimer's disease and cognitive decline in aging populations. And really the thinking here is, again, that this constant switching back and forth provides exercise for the brain, and it's a good thing. And finally, then there are some economic advantages. We know that across most sectors of the economy these days, businesses overwhelmingly prefer to hire multilingual employees, and among the millennial generation, multilingual employees earn more on average. Okay, now let's turn to some of the myths around bilingualism. I love hearing these. I usually, I'll be playing at a playground with my kids, and, we talk in whatever different languages we talk, and then every now and then there's a concerned parent that comes and says something like, oh my gosh, aren't you worried that you're gonna, confuse them, or are they talking, all kinds of things, and I just kind of always I say something like, tell me more. And I don't tell them what I do, It's really entertaining. Anyway, maybe I shouldn't be doing this, but I do. Okay, so one of the myths that I'm sure you have heard is that bilingualism causes confusion, or multilingualism, that it causes confusion. And I want to start out by looking at this particular myth. And to introduce you to this myth, I want you to look at this image. What is this? Does everybody know what these are? What are they? Goldfish crackers, right? Okay. So now I'm going to show you a video of my son. In this video, he is 18 months old, okay? And we're talking about goldfish crackers here. Let's see.
Sancho, what are you eating?
Goldfish.
Yum.
More.
How do you call it?
Goldfish.
I don't know if you heard that. Did you guys hear it? Oh, stop. Okay.
Sancho, what are you eating?
Goldfish.
Yum.
More.
How do you call it?
Goldfish.
Goldfish, right? So there's also, by the way, jellyfish and starfish down at the Seattle Aquarium. So what's interesting about this is that he has not heard goldfish in the input, right? Nobody calls it goldfish, right? We call it goldfish. But he has heard fish in other instances, right? And here, he was able to come up with this on his own, and he calls it goldfish. Now, I really want to encourage you to think about the kinds of things he has to know to be able to do this, right? And I'm not saying that my son is anything special or particularly anything, extra smart or anything like that. That's what bilingual kids do. What's really interesting is to just think about what it takes to be able to do something like this. Now, if you think about an older child, right, once this is, he's 18 months here, so mostly producing single words, still just starting to combine. And so what you'll see is oftentimes they'll switch, they'll use different, a little bit of English, a little bit of Spanish, a little bit of Slovene, depending on the context, right? Once they start to actually string together words into sentences, things get really, really interesting. And so if you are in a trilingual household, you might actually hear sometimes sentences that combine 3 languages, right? Or you might hear sentences that combine 2, any 2 really, depending on the situation. So I'll give you an example. And now this is another son of mine, not the same one, different one, when he was about 4 years old. This is a sentence that I heard, "Mom, is Daddy potušem?" Now this is English and Slovene. And one thing to think about really is, why does he use sentences like this? Clearly, at this age, he was able to have conversations in both languages, right? One reason that he might use sentences like this is that he might know some words better in one language than in the other, right? Bathroom vocabulary, most of that took place in Slovenian in our household, not so much in English, so it's possible that he knew some words better in one language than the other and used to choose them to be able to communicate. Now, the other thing to know is that he very much knows that I can understand him and I will respond if he uses a little bit of English and a little bit of Spanish. What's interesting is that usually bilingual kids will not use another language in a situation that doesn't allow for it. So he would very rarely use Slovenian in his preschool, for example, and you can imagine why. Because that would not get him very far, right? So what we know is that bilingual children typically match the language to that of their conversational partner, and they can do that as early as about 2 years of age. They don't always do it perfectly, but if you were to actually measure the proportion of Spanish or English or Slovene that he uses, you will see that he will increase the language percentage to match the conversational partner, and that happens as early as 2 years of age. Now, one more thing that I want to show you. So another thing that's interesting is that he will not say sentences like, "Mom, is daddy potush?" Right? You can say daddy goes potush, but daddy is potush is wrong, it's bad. And those of you who are native speakers of Slovene are cringing when you hear this, right? Right? I'm just kidding. No, but the point is, so why is "mom is daddy potush," why is this bad? It's bad because is and goes, they're different verbs, right? Is requires, is describes a state, and goes describes motion, and depending on that, you need to have different endings on the noun that follows, okay? So this is bad, 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 at the level of, mommy go to store. That's bad, right? You need an S on the verb. So that's the level of how bad this is. And so you don't hear sentences like this. You hear this and this, but not this, okay? What this means is that code switching, which is what we call this phenomenon, it's not just randomly jumbling together words of different languages. It is a highly structured process, meaning that there is a right way to do it and there is a wrong way to do it. And if you want to do it the right way, it requires a lot of linguistic sophistication, okay? So we now know that code switching is a highly structured process. We know that it is common and natural in bilingual adults, as it is in bilingual kids. So another reason why kids code switch is that they hear adults code switching. It's perfectly fine, and we adults who use multiple languages, we do it all the time, not because we're confused, but because we're trying to communicate, okay? Common and natural in both kids and adults. It's usually limited to specific contexts where we know that we're gonna be understood, and contexts where we know that it's okay to code switch. Bilingual infants, we know, can distinguish between two languages within the first year, so they do not confuse the two languages. They know that there are two different systems within the first year of life. And we know that bilinguals adjust the language to match their interlocutor from very early on. So the conclusion here is that code switching really is a sign of linguistic sophistication, not confusion, okay? The second myth that I'd like to discuss is that bilingualism slows down language learning. Now, one graph that I'd like to show you to discuss this particular myth is from Erika Hoff's 2012 paper. So lots of lines here, but let's focus on the yellow and red. So these are the bilingual vocabularies. So what you see on the y-axis is infants' a number of words produced measured by the CDI, the MacArthur-Bates questionnaire, and then you have age on the bottom here. So what you see in in gray is monolingual kids' vocabulary growth. So babies who were raised in English-only speaking families are represented in gray, and you see how their vocabulary is growing nicely. Now, here we have bilingual babies. In red is their vocabulary in English, and in yellow is their vocabulary in Spanish. So, a couple of things to note. The first one being that if we are only looking at the English vocabulary, they are below their monolingual peers, okay? If we're only looking at their Spanish vocabulary, they're also below their monolingual peers, okay? However, if we look at what we call conceptual vocabulary, meaning that we're giving them credit for every concept that they can name, regardless of language, they are matched to their monolingual peers. What does this mean? What is conceptual vocabulary? It means that basically we're giving them credit for every word they can name, for every word they have, regardless of language. So pelota and ball, that counts as one, right? But pelota and sock, that's two different items, right? So let's just be very clear on how this works. Conceptual vocabulary, again, this is an example of my son when he was 14 months of age, and of course, me being a big language dork, I was keeping track of this stuff. Not for very long, because it got overwhelming, but I was at the beginning. Here we go. So this is three languages, Slovene, Spanish, and English. These are some of his early words, right? So how many words does he have? If we look at the totals, that would be 6 in Slovene, 4 in Spanish, and 5 in English. So total is 15. But if we now want to calculate his conceptual vocabulary, we have to subtract 3 because they're repeated, okay? And so his total conceptual vocabulary is 12. It is not 5, okay? 5 is his English vocabulary, but that's not a fair comparison. His conceptual vocabulary is 12, okay? And that is a fair comparison. Now, of course, we have a problem here, which is that somebody would have to be able to measure his vocabulary in Slovene, right? And that is the problem that we have oftentimes as a field, that we don't have professionals who can measure vocabularies in different languages. But that's a different story. Now, other things to know is that we know from research that the onset of different language milestones, like babbling, first words, word combinations, is the same in monolingual and bilingual babies. And the rates of language delay is the same as in bilingual and monolingual babies, meaning that, of course, if you are bilingual, you can have language delay, just like you can have language delay if you're monolingual. But the fact that the rates are the same in these two populations suggests that these delays are not caused by bilingualism, okay? Now, one thing, though, to be aware of is that the quantity and quality of language exposure in each language is predictive of outcomes. What does this mean? It means that we have to be aware that these babies are still splitting their time between two different languages. So if they have 90% of their input in Spanish and 10% in English, it is 100% expected that their vocabulary in English will be smaller compared to their vocabulary in Spanish. And so sometimes we forget this and we say things like babies are sponges, they soak in language. Sometimes people misinterpret that as meaning they're gonna be bilingual just because their parents speak Spanish. That can be the case, but it doesn't have to be the case if they don't speak to them in Spanish, or if they spend very little time with them. So what we know, again, from research is that quantity and quality of language input matter. And I showed you earlier the results of the MEG study that showed about, the sensitivity to both languages. However, we know from other studies that if we look at babies who do not have equal exposure to each language, but have much more of one versus the other, you can measure these differences in their brains as early as 11 months of age, right? So the strength of their brain responses to each language will match the amount of input that they have in each language, and their vocabulary size reflects the amount of input also. It's not just the amount of input, it is also the quality of input. And so what is quality, right? What is high quality input? We could have a whole nother lecture on that alone, but I'll just scratch the surface here. One thing that we know that matters is whether the input is directed to the child or overheard, right? So we know that in Spanish-English bilingual infants, the amount of Spanish infant-directed speech in one-on-one interactions predicts vocabulary in Spanish, but not in English. And the same is true for infant-directed speech in English, right? So it will predict vocabulary in English, but not across to the other language, okay? Now, let's think a little bit about language input. What do children need in order to learn language? Obviously, they need input. If we want them to learn Spanish, they will need to hear Spanish. If we want them to learn English, they'll need to hear English. We know that. But I want to go just a little bit beyond that. Does this source of input matter? If all that matters is just that they are exposed to language A or language B, then the quality of input, the type of language exposure shouldn't matter, right? If this is just a statistical process, if they're just detecting patterns in the language statistically, like a computer, then it shouldn't matter whether they hear this input from a live human or from a radio, for example, or TV. So there was a study addressing this very question. So this was the so-called Mandarin exposure study, and it looked at that transition from being a universal listener to being a native language specialist that I talked about at the beginning of this lecture. So the question here was, if we take monolingually raised English babies, so babies from English-only speaking families in Seattle, if we take these babies and we bring them into the lab and expose them to Mandarin Chinese during this critical period in development when they typically transition to becoming native language specialists, can we reverse this effect? Can we reverse this by exposing them to a foreign language? Okay, everybody with me on this? Okay, so the question is are English-speaking babies going to be able to learn to discriminate the contrasts in Mandarin Chinese if we expose them to Mandarin Chinese during this critical period in development? And we have 3 groups of babies. Some babies came to the lab and were exposed to Mandarin Chinese through live interactions with a native Mandarin speaker. The other group of babies was exposed to the same amount of Mandarin, but through a DVD session, and the third group of babies was exposed to the same amount of Mandarin, but through audio exposure, okay? And then there was a 4th group that I didn't put on this graph, or this graphic. It's called a control group, and that group came to the lab and played in English. And that's just to make sure that just by coming to our lab, you don't automatically learn Mandarin Chinese, okay? So these babies were 9 months old, naturalistic Mandarin exposure, 6 weeks of intervention, 12 sessions, 25 minutes each, so that's just under 6 hours of total exposure to Mandarin. The question is, can we reverse the effect? Okay, so this is usually the type of graph that you will see without any intervention, right? So if we look at the discrimination of Mandarin sounds, for babies raised in Taiwan who are exposed to Mandarin day in and day out, you will see this type of line where they're pretty good at it at 6 to 8 months, but they get better and better, okay? For American babies who are not exposed to Mandarin, you will see this type of line, right? Where they're okay at it, they can discriminate at 6 to 8 months, but then they start to lose this ability, okay? Now the question is, what happens to the intervention babies, okay? Now, babies who came to the lab to play in English did not learn Mandarin Chinese. Good, right? This is a sanity check. Now, what do you think happened with those babies who came to the lab and played with a native Mandarin speaker? Did they learn anything? Yes or no? Yes? Yeah, they actually learned at the rate equivalent to those babies raised in Taiwan. Okay? What about the TV babies or the audio babies? Well, they learned absolutely nothing, actually. So they learned nothing. There are 2 very important findings that came out of this study. One is that at this critical period during development, you actually don't need a whole lot of exposure, right? 12 hours is not a whole lot. However, this exposure needs to happen through social interactions, okay? So there are at least 2 ways to learn. Yes, babies track statistics of the language input, but they're also social learners, okay? And we can now start to think about some of the ingredients of social interactions that matter, and they are the back and forth exchanges that you can have. If a baby looks at a bottle and says, ba, the mom says, yes, that's a bottle. In her high-pitched infant-directed speech, the baby will most likely get close to saying bottle the next time, okay? So language learning takes place through social interactions, and bilingual children need high frequency and high quality input in both languages, okay? So I want to conclude by summarizing what I have told you so far. We have learned that the brain is prepared to learn multiple languages at the same time. We have seen that at 11 months of age, the baby brain is sensitive to whatever language or languages it was exposed to, okay? We saw that there might be advantages, greater cognitive flexibility, greater activity in executive function areas. We saw that language growth is related to quality and quantity of language that children hear. Supporting both or all languages through the school years is important. So not all the work is done in infancy, right? We saw that infancy is a critical period. However, those Mandarin exposed babies, they're now adults, and I don't think any of them speak Mandarin, right? You'd probably agree that it's not like they learn Mandarin in those 6 hours of exposure, right? We need to continue, okay? And finally, I didn't get to talk about all caregivers, but all caregivers matter. It's not just moms, right? It's moms, dads, aunts, uncles, teachers, and so on. So providing high quality input in both languages is a good idea for all caregivers. Thank you, and I'll take some questions now.
Thank you, Naja, for that wonderful presentation. And now we ask the members of the audience that would like to, or that have questions, to please come forward to the microphones. That way everybody can listen to the question. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, I've got a question, or kind of a comment, because my children were raised in a bilingual environment, and so these things, the code switching, all that stuff is very familiar. I would say, on our experience, both of our children had language issues in terms of they seem to be behind, really, in at least in the facility in the languages. Maybe they had the same vocabulary, but they were behind in each language, for a long time. And one area where this code switching kind of thing didn't seem to really work was in the grammar. So they did not seem to have the same facility, so they would bring the wrong grammar into the languages. So they would speak maybe according to an English grammar when they should have been speaking that language was Hungarian, a Hungarian grammar, and that was a larger issue. So I don't know if that's something. I mean, that's more complicated because speaking in a language isn't just sort of using the different words. You have a different way of expressing yourself with a different grammar, and that seemed to me they didn't seem to be, and they'd probably even say today they have trouble speaking comfortably or naturally in the grammars, I would guess. And it's a challenge even today, I think. So anyway.
Yeah, so one thing that's important to understand is that, what happens after, right? What I showed you was this graph that I believe it ended at 3 years, right? And if you look at their vocabularies or even grammars, if you measure any one individual language, they might be behind. The idea is that if both languages are supported and continue to be supported throughout elementary school and middle school and so on, that these differences will later on will disappear, right? That they will be able to use what they know about one language and what they know about the other language to help themselves in grammar and in vocabulary development across languages, okay? But we cannot expect them initially in the first years when they're still learning, we cannot expect them to be at the same level in any one of the two languages. The idea is that later on, when input continues to be provided and when both languages continue to be supported, that these differences will over time disappear. And we know that they can achieve native-like fluency in both languages by the time they reach middle school or so, if both languages are supported and continue to be supported. Now, oftentimes what happens is that one language will be dropped, right, or reduced.
Following up on the same theme, okay?
Sure.
3 cases. On code switching as a child, when the granddaughter was, and I grew up with 2 languages, and their parents were both bilingual, so 3 generations of multilingual parents and grandparents. By the age of 2, she could converse, and we'd talk on the phone, and at that age, what was funny, it made me laugh, is that our code switching was could go in either direction, depending. She'd say, oh, abuelito, I like, no, me gusta mucho el hat que tienes. Now, mother would get together and say, sombrero, mijita. And she'd say, hat is easier. And it could be the other way around. By the time she was 3, she quit doing that, unless she was talking to somebody that was comfortable with code switching, which her mother wasn't, but the rest of us were. The second thing is maintenance, which we just finished talking about. In each individual language, English and Spanish in this case, by the time they were 5 years old, we could notice some cases where they would ask another 5-year-old, what does that mean? They were talking Spanish, they would ask what it meant in English, and vice versa. By the time they're in the 3rd grade, their vocabularies, for 3 out of the 4 grandkids, vocabularies were stronger in English than most of their fellow students, one exception. But the parents kept on in both languages. What's interesting, in the one case, the mother was Filipino, but she says, nobody talks Filipino, but everybody talks Spanish. And so they want to watch Dora la Exploradora, which they had to watch, not Dora the Explorer. If you want to watch it, you have to watch it in Spanish. Oh, but Mommy, English is easy. You got English all day in school. At home, you watch Spanish. So just to continue on your theme, watching the 4 grandkids grow up are an affirmation of from the day they were born, and now the oldest is at Columbia, so she wasn't hurt by growing up bilingual. I affirm your talk, and I thank you for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. Yes, it's always fun to hear these stories and anecdotes.
I'm actually going to have to interrupt you. Sorry, because we do have another talk. We're on a very strict time schedule, but maybe we can catch up after the talk as well. So I just want to say that this concludes our session. If you would please give me a thank you again to Dr. Ferjan Ramirez, and thank you. If you're able to, we would love to have you stick around. We'll just take a short 5-minute break, and at 10:30 we'll have our next speaker, Dr. Ken Patowski. Thank you for coming.